Hello, and thank you for joining us on Aviation News Talk for a Newsmakers edition, where we talk to people who are making the news. Now, there's been much discussion in the industry of a pilot and a CFI shortage, but in some parts of the country, there's also a shortage of DPEs, or designated pilot examiners, who give check rides. And in a moment, we'll be sitting down with Jason Blair. He's a DPE, and we'll talk briefly about that situation. And then we'll talk at length about the check ride gotchas, those many things that can stop your check ride dead in its tracks just minutes into your check ride. And since this is the last show of the month, that's the show in which I read the names of all of our high-level Patreon sponsors who contribute $20 a month or more to help support this show, which I greatly appreciate, and I'll be reading all of their names at the end of the show. Now buckle up, because this Newsmakers edition starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation and the people in our industry. I'm Max Trescott, and if you're new to this show, we have a weekly show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news from around the world. And we also interview movers and shakers in the aviation industry, which is what we're doing today. You probably know that to get a private pilot certificate, eventually all student pilots have to go through the dreaded check ride with an FAA designated pilot examiner. We talked about check ride anxiety in episode 33, and my point then was there's no reason to have anxiety about a check ride if you're fully prepared. Unfortunately, a lot of people fail to find small errors in their logbooks or omissions in their flight training, and these problems can bring an immediate halt in the first few minutes of a check ride and send you home almost before you got started. That first part of the check ride, where the examiner goes through your logbook and documents, is called the qualification process, and not enough attention is devoted to preparing for this important part of the check ride. Earlier today, I talked with Jason Blair about the many gotchas he finds during the qualification process and what you can do to make sure that they don't trip you up on your next check ride. Now let me tell you about Jason Blair. Jason is an FAA DPE, or designated pilot examiner, who gives check rides to pilots, and he's also an active flight instructor. Now, he got an early start in aviation, taking flying lessons at age 15. He soloed at 16 and got his private certificate at 17. He attended Western Michigan University and has undergraduate degrees in human resource management and international comparative politics, and a master's degree in development administration. Now, these days, he's often back there at his alma mater, giving check rides to WMU students. He's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he serves on a number of industry committees. He's an active writer and consultant, and he's accumulated over 5,000 hours of flight time, and in his role as an examiner, he's issued over 1,000 pilot certificates. Now, on top of all that, he's a listener to this show, and he's also one of our supporters who donates each month through patreon.com to support the Aviation News Talk podcast. Well, Jason, I'd like to officially welcome you to the Aviation News Talk podcast. We are very excited to have you here.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure to be on the show with you, and you and I have talked on other shows as well, and glad to be able to do so on this one.
Well, we've known each other for many, many years, and I've always thought of you as an expert when it comes to kind of what's going on in the DPE world. So tell us a little bit about the pilot examiner shortage and how that's affecting people's ability to get a check ride these days.
You know, that's kind of an interesting hot button question in some local, we'll call them flight standards offices now. We've had a change in some of the structure with the FAA. They're no longer just a district office, but they are doing the same work as before. And some of those offices have more or less pilot examiners available to them to do the work of testing pilot applicants within a particular area. And in some areas, this has caused very long delays in getting practical tests scheduled. In some places, we're seeing it as long as 7 or 8 weeks, or where applicants are actively needing to fly to other areas where there might be more pilot examiners available. This can certainly be pretty frustrating for people when you're trying to get that check ride done, and especially if you get a weathered out day and end up needing to reschedule for another month or so to get that test done. But it is something we're working on, and really the root cause of this is if we look back over, we'll say, a decade or so, we did have a lot more pilot examiners, and much like our pilot community, our examiner community is aging at the same time, and many people did step out of being examiners through retirement or through lack of currency as an examiner in their own flying that would allow them to stay being an examiner. If we look back to kind of the late 80s and early 90s, we had somewhere between 15 and 1600 pilot examiners, and if we go back to the 2007 or 2011 range, we were about 1200 and then around 950, and right now we're actually sitting in 2017 at about 830 or so active pilot examiners, so a significant decrease in the number of examiners. As we looked at some of the numbers through the 90s, we actually saw a little drop off in the number of pilot certificates being issued. However, that's coming back up right now as the community for pilot training is working hard to fill the seats in many airliners that are actively hiring. And we see the ratio changing over the last few years for the number of average tests an examiner might need to give on any given year. And this would just be an average if we looked at 2011, based on the number of examiners there were and the number of practical tests that were given by DPEs, which is a little over 60,000 of those in 2011. It meant the average examiner needed to give around 64 or 65 check rides a year. If we fast forward to the 2016 numbers, we don't have the 2017 ones yet, but 2016 we did about 78,000 practical tests by DPE, so up, another 18,000 or so with less examiners, about 200 less. It means the average examiner really needed to give somewhere around 100 practical tests in a year, which means they're pretty darn busy. And DPEs are typically people within the aviation industry who are not doing this full time. They many times have other professional pilotage jobs or work in other areas of the industry as well. So it's a part-time thing. And this is just an average. There are certainly examiners who give more check rides a year. I personally give somewhere around 220 or 230 of those practical tests a year. So it keeps me pretty darn busy. But I have the fortune of flexibility with some of the other work I do, being able to be done when the weather's not so good to do those practical tests. So it is something we've actively been working on as a couple of groups in the industry to try and help the FAA find good applicants that can fill some of those retirements and make sure we have examiners in the places where high density training is happening. And you can think of some of those hot button spots like South Florida, Northern Florida, Southern California, a lot of the West Coast, actually, Texas. Basically, wherever there's really good weather and there's large training environments, we probably have a higher density of training, and we're working to try and make sure that the flight standards offices there have the resources they need to keep examiners available. And if we have some more, we'll hopefully knock down the amount of time it takes to get a practical test scheduled.
Now, isn't there a little bit of a catch-22 here? A lot of listeners may not realize that examiners are under scrutiny as well. And my understanding is the more check rides you give, the more scrutiny you're going to be under and the more reviews you're going to have to do with your FAA bosses. Tell us about how this works out, where if you give more check rides, you may have more scrutiny.
Sure, and this is kind of the dirty secret side of the examiner world. I mean, there's really only about 830 of us that do this on a regular basis, and probably less than 300 that do what we call high activity examining on a yearly basis. There's an FAA order. It's not a regulation. It's an order, a guidance document that examiners are structured underneath, that they are designated by and then also have to adhere to when we give practical tests. And if we do more than 50 processings of practical tests, that would include a test or a retest or a discontinuance in any one quarter, it does trigger the need for the Flight Standards Office to give us an extra oversight ride per year. And what an oversight ride is when somebody from the local Flight Standards Office comes out and rides along on the check ride, adding that super extra nervousness for the applicant, I'm sure, but also makes us pretty darn nervous as the examiner. We want to make sure we're doing a good job, and our point of contact with the FAA, our ops inspector that is working with us, does have to come out and watch us give some tests on a regular basis. And at a minimum, an examiner is going to get one of those per year. But as they get more active as an examiner, they are going to get more of those per year, anywhere up to 4 potentially, doing one every quarter for a very, very active examiner. In some cases, we also get what's called a special examiner evaluation oversight ride, where somebody not from our local office comes in, but somebody from the national or previously regional offices comes in and provides an oversight on the examiner as well. This could be an additional one, and that's not necessarily just triggered by number of check rides, but it also might be triggered by any number of other factors. Things like how long does it take us to do a check ride? What's our pass rate? Are we only doing check rides at one location? There's a number of factors that the FAA looks at from a national perspective as they evaluate our examiners, to also put some additional oversight to make sure we're doing our job properly, that we're administering those airman certification standards and following the FAA order that makes us do our job. So there is certainly another factor in there of the examiners getting checked along with the checks that the examiners give to the practical test applicants.
So there's really a disincentive to an examiner to giving more and more check rides, it sounds like.
Well, there's certainly a disincentive from the oversight ride, but the other side, there's definitely an incentive from the compensation side, I would argue. So, there's a balance in there somewhere where an examiner chooses how many check rides they want to do and what the cost benefit analysis for personal desire to do those check rides is, I'm sure comes into play in some respects.
So given that examiners are a little tough to schedule in some areas, do you have any advice to offer to student pilots or pilots working on other ratings as to how to go about scheduling a check ride so you can get an examiner when you need one?
I sure do. And there's a couple things that I would say are critical here. One is make sure you're actually ready for the check ride when you go ahead and schedule it. And we're reasonable folks. If you stay in contact with us, we know there are weather delays and things like that. I mean, I had somebody this morning that gave me a call and said, hey, I'm on for next Monday, but boy, the weather has been pretty lousy and I just didn't get that stage check done. Can we push it back? And that's perfectly fine. We get a little grumpier when you call us at 9 in the morning and say, I'm supposed to be there at 10, but I didn't do my last 3 flights and I just don't meet the requirements. That doesn't allow us to backfill that slot. And this, one person will look at that and say, you just want to fill that slot to make the money. But I also look at it and say, man, I just want to get some people through these. And I hate to see a really nice day go by when we could get somebody done with a check ride, especially when we are backed up on tests. So, stay in good communication with the examiner, but make sure you're ready for that. And, it's nothing wrong with asking them, is there a possibility of setting up a backup time? And that's something that I do on many occasions, especially here in the Midwest where our winter weather is a little scuzzy, we'll call it. And, sometimes we'll set up a Monday and a Friday, and hopefully one of those two turns out to be good weather for us. So.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan to have a backup. So tell us a little bit about a check ride for people who haven't been through one yet. What are the first few minutes like, and what, if anything, do you do to help settle people's nerves?
Today's as we're talking here, I'm kind of disappointed I didn't get to do the check ride I was planning. It's Halloween, and I was really planning on showing up in that Darth Vader helmet to really get the guys' nerves going.
You don't wear that every day?
It's less awkward when I do it on Halloween.
Okay.
They really question it on the rest of the year. But, the biggest thing to do in the check ride first few minutes is to understand that we're going to just go through paperwork. And that's a big part of making sure that practical test is going to actually happen on that day, is to making sure everything is set that we can give you a check ride. And that's part of the job of the examiner, is we're not supposed to give somebody a check ride they're not qualified for. And it is not uncommon for us to find something that we need to turn around and go home for because we cannot actually administrate the check ride on that particular day. So the first few minutes are really going to be qualifying the applicant for that practical test to make sure we can actually administrate it on that day. And that can take, a few minutes if everything is in perfect order, or if things aren't, it can drag out for an hour or two as we try and collect all the pieces to see if we can even give that test on any given day.
All right, so let's talk about the qualification process. What are the major elements included in that?
So as we think about the qualification for a practical test, the main things are going to be that the experience requirements have actually been met, that the training has been completed, and everything that needs to be met by those FAA regulations is completed, that the aircraft that's being provided is airworthy, and certainly is capable of doing the test that's going to be administrated on that day. And then also making sure all of the application materials and endorsements are completed that would allow the examiner to then give the test as well. In any of these, we can run into hiccups that can be stopping points for a test and send everybody kind of home hoping and wishing that maybe we could have fixed it instead of giving a test on that day. And it gets pretty frustrating for the applicant who really, worked up to that day and wants to get it done. And boy, it's frustrating when you got to go home and you're not really doing the check ride on the day you planned it.
And so let's just talk about, for example, the aircraft. What kinds of things are you looking for when an applicant tells you about the aircraft? And what are some common ways that you don't get to fly after examining those documents?
So as we think about qualifying the aircraft for a practical test, we certainly have the basic FAA requirements that have to be met, the documents that need to be in the aircraft, and the inspections that need to be completed for that aircraft to be legally able to fly. And these are things you start to think about and go, man, how do we miss that? But there's actually some really easy gotchas that can send us home on a practical test. If we think about some of the common aircraft that are used for practical tests, many of them have exhaust ADs on them that might be 25 or 50 hour ADs. Could be a seat track AD on many of the older Cessnas. If we think about things that can cause that AD to be overflown, if the applicant shows up to that check ride and it's even an hour or two beyond that AD inspection, the examiner is not actually allowed to get in and fly that aircraft home. These are very, very little things, but they are things that would make it such that the aircraft is technically not legal to be flown. Doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong, not necessarily, but it does mean the paperwork is not in order and that we can't give the test on that given day. ELTs are something that can easily be missed, and we make sure that ELT inspection is current. Pedostatic inspections can easily be missed and not within currency, and especially if we're going to be doing an instrument practical test, that becomes a critical part. So making sure those inspections are completed, up to date, and are available for review by the examiner on the day of the practical test are an important part of making sure the aircraft is within compliance from a documentary standpoint as well. Certainly, we've all got some horror stories of things that people have showed up to check rides for in the aircraft itself beyond the documents. We want to make sure everything's working properly, or if it isn't, it has been properly and by a maintenance person deemed inoperable, and has been made notes in the logbook as such and has been placarded and disabled. So I can tell you, I remember a moment where somebody showed up on a practical test with an aircraft in the circuit breaker for the alternator was taped down. And it got me kind of curious, and I hadn't looked at the aircraft physically prior to the flight portion. We had done the ground portion, and I came out, and as we were doing the pre-flight, I looked in and saw the tape, and I said, "So what's the tape on the alternator breaker for?" And he said, "Well, it keeps popping." I said, "Well, why'd you tape it down?" He said, "Well, it stops it from popping." I said, maybe we're not going to fly this today because that's probably a good indication there's actually a problem. Simple things can really catch up over time, and that's probably not a simple thing. But there's lots of little things that can come up. A fellow examiner recently had somebody show up to a check ride, and he noticed on the pre-flight the Cherokee had the landing light duct taped into the cowling. It certainly held on the way there, but it was most certainly not what we would call an appropriate maintenance fix to have that aircraft airworthy for the day of a practical test. So, sometimes the gee whiz, does that really look strange and maybe shouldn't I do that test just needs to apply. I mean, we're not going to take the aircraft apart on a maintenance inspection for the practical test, but we do need to see that, there aren't major glaring things that would cause us to be uncomfortable getting in the aircraft, or obviously understand that the aircraft is probably not airworthy. With that, it's definitely worth having a good list of the airworthiness directives and their compliance, and if there are any reoccurring ones with those documents for the day of a practical test. And this is something that if we cannot, as an examiner, identify what the applicable ADs are based on the logbooks, it's likely we're going to send somebody home and say, come on back another day when you can show me that. And that's a pretty frustrating point, again, for somebody who's looking to get that check ride done, especially if they flew to that test and they feel that the aircraft it was good to get them there, but that doesn't always mean that we have enough proof that the aircraft is okay for us to fly for that practical test.
And I probably jumped ahead asking you about aircraft, but I was really interested in that. Why don't you step back and just kind of talk to us about the order that you go through when you qualify and the things that you're looking for and some of the things that you find that are common problems?
I will do that. And certainly I'm a little bit spoiled. I will say that many of the practical tests I give are at a Part 141 collegiate university environment training location where I know that the applicants have been through multiple stage checks and what we call a folder audit. So prior to me getting to see any of their application materials, somebody else has gone through it and tried to find the holes that might cause me to send them home. And I'm not saying we never find them, but every once in a while we find one. But the majority of them are caught. And this is something that I would advise any student and or instructor to do if you're not in a 141 environment where you have stage checks and folder audits. There's nothing wrong with taking a fellow flight instructor and having a meet with your student and say, look, I think I got everything set up. Can you run through this and make sure I'm not missing something? So when I sit down with an applicant, the first things I'm going to do is make sure they have their proper documentation with them personally. And that means that they have to have a student pilot certificate if they're going for something that's pre-private. They have to have their medical or medical equivalent now, right? We have the basic med options out there. And then they're going to need to have some sort of valid photo identification with them. And it's surprising how many times I've had to go scrounging to get these basic items for somebody that, they showed up and they forgot their ID at home, or in a recent case didn't know they needed a student pilot certificate, which certainly caused some other troubles that they had soloed without a student pilot certificate. Or in a recent case from another examiner, and this is something for many instructors to pay attention to, that they were not necessarily in compliance with basic med. If they are using the basic med provisions, that they do need to make sure they understand how to be in compliance with that prior to a practical test. So we're going to start with those basic documents. Do you have your license, your medical, and your photo ID? And all of those things are things that we need to have to be able to even continue forward into the test. And there are certainly limited numbers of things that we can accept as photo ID as well. We can't take your library card just yet. So basically, if you could use it to get on a commercial airliner, you can probably use it for the FAA, although there are certainly a couple of limitations on that. Once we've got those basic things, I'm going to actually sit down with somebody's logbook, and if it's in IACRA or paper 8710, the application, and we're going to go through and make sure they have met the requirements for that rating or certificate that they are there to try and complete that day. And many times this is where we run into more hiccups. In a recent case, I had a commercial pilot applicant. It was a commercial single engine, and there's a provision that they have to have 10 hours of inclusive of some night flight time with some night cross country dual and some day cross country dual, and then there's a section of 10 hours that's either solo, and it specifically says or dual, that would include their long cross country and their night time with 10 takeoffs and landings at a controlled airport. And as we dug into it, we found that the long cross country had been flown with an instructor, but the nighttime had been flown solo. Well, the way the regs read, it's not an and or, it's specifically or. So it either has to be all of that 10 hours has to be solo, or all of that 10 hours has to be dual. And what we found is we were 0.3 hours short of night flight time, one takeoff and landing short of takeoffs and landings at a controlled airport, and the poor applicant was left needing to go ahead and redo some flight time because I wasn't able to give them a practical test. So looking at those details very closely of what the requirements are is important to making sure that we're going to be able to give a practical test, and that's what we're going to do as we go through the logbook. And just kind of a side note here, boy, the cleaner that logbook is and the nicer it is, the easier it makes us able to find that time. And if your logbook is not the cleanest, maybe a nice spreadsheet to back it up or something can certainly help expedite that process for the applicant and the examiner on the day of the practical test. None of these are surprises. These are things you can look up. There's many checklists out there. We want to make sure if we're doing a private pilot, we know that you got the 40 hours. Most people get that. But, have you done the 3 hours at night? Or have you done the, the specific solo cross country? Many times I've come out, and instead of the 5 hours of solo cross country, I found 4.9 hours of solo cross country. Boy, that gets pretty tough when I got to tell you, sorry, I know you're 0.1 short. but you're going to have to go fly something more than 50 miles. So, and with that, making sure those cross-country flights, and this is something we do check, is that they're actually meeting the requirements. I had an applicant recently, we had 2 cross-countries that were 47 miles. They didn't meet the 50, so, he got to go fly those again, which is not only frustrating, but also costly in his case to have to go back and fly those hours over. Certainly fun to go flying, but on an unlimited budget, that'd be one thing, but many of us are not working with that. So this can be something that gets costly if we don't find it ahead of time, and it's something that the examiner is going to look for in that process. Once we've qualified the experience requirements are met, we're going to actually dig into the logbook for the endorsements from the instructor, and this is where the pitch I give of, boy, it's a really nice idea to have the instructor available on that day of the test. If we do find any hiccups in the paperwork, especially for those endorsements, they can fix that right then and there instead of having to try and track them down if they're out on a flight somewhere else, or even worse, off at airline training, something like that. It's nice to have that availability of the instructor so that if we do have something wrong in an endorsement, we can correct it. And most of the practical tests are going to require 4 endorsable areas. There's some aeronautical experience, there's the proficiency in the maneuvers, and then there's that they've reconciled areas found deficient on a knowledge test, and that they've given instruction within the last 2 calendar months. And if any of those pieces are missing and we can't reconcile it, again, we just don't get to give a check ride as an examiner. Once all that's done, we're going to jump into either, hopefully, a digital IACRA processing of the application for the check ride. If we have to, it'll be a paper one, but most of us are doing this in digital now using the FAA's processing system, and then we'll kind of match all that stuff up. We go into the application and make sure the information matches from a knowledge test and or a student pilot or a medical certificate or previous pilot certificates if we're doing advanced ratings. And if any of that stuff doesn't match, we also then have to fix that. So, some of the common things we run into in there are name mismatches. If we have a driver's license that says, John Smith Doe, and then we have a pilot certificate that says John S. Doe, and then we have a knowledge test that says John no middle name Doe, those 3 things aren't going to match up, and we're going to be stuck from a paperwork standpoint at getting this fixed. And again, not be able to give a practical test. I think you're getting the feeling here that there's lots of ways we can stop and not be able to give a practical test, and that's really kind of the truth, which is why it's pretty important for the applicant and the instructor prior to the test to make sure all of these things match up. That way when they do get to the test day, the DPE is going to be able to kind of breeze through this stuff and find everything matching and make it work.
So let's talk a little bit more about the name matching, because I know that's a big deal that comes up quite frequently. I had a candidate recently, and before we sent him to the Checkride, we found that, yes, there were some missing middle names on some of the documents, and the examiner in this case said, well, make sure you do it as a paper 8710 application rather than IACRA. How does that help resolve that type of situation? And what are other ways that you resolve these name mismatches?
So this is kind of an interesting point with the name mismatching that does happen with some regularity. It's getting a little bit more common, actually, as we have student pilot certificates that are being issued by instructors who are not necessarily engaged on an active basis with the IACRA process, where they might not put a full middle name in. If we get somebody who only does 1 or 2 of these a year, they're less familiar with the process. And then when somebody goes to do a test, it does get a little bit tough. Many times the state IDs have variances in what is listed on them as well. And this does create the potential for a mismatch of a name in multiple FAA documents. It gets a lot more complicated to change a name after somebody already has a pilot certificate. But when we first start looking at getting names correctly entered into the FAA system, the best plan of action is to have it always be the first name, full middle name, and full last name for the individual who has any pilot or medical certificate. That's the consistency that we're going to be looking for in the system. And if we find there are discrepancies in it, it may require a name change to officially be executed by the individual with the pilot certificate or the applicant with an actual flight standards office prior to being able to administrate a practical test. I know that sounds a little bit scary, and it does typically mean they're going to have a visit to their flight standards office to do that. Where sometimes we can correct this on the spot as an examiner is if we find they had the name John Smith Doe on their pilot certificate, John Smith Doe on their photo ID, and then we jump into IACRA and it has John S. Doe, and the full spelling of the middle name is not there. We're actually able to send that application back to them in IACRA and have them fully spell out the middle name to correct that. Where it gets more challenging is if we have a difference of name spelling or full name or middle name, or even adding a junior or a senior at the end of a name as a suffix on an FAA knowledge test. When we as instructors enter the knowledge test, if it does not match up with the individual's name in IACRA and the knowledge test database, it will not necessarily populate that field in IACRA and may require that the examiner does a paper application to fix that. Where the paper application can help some of these is that the examiner and the applicant are able to physically make notations on that and then send a correction package to the FAA that would properly list the name as it should be to match it up with the FAA knowledge test.
Let's talk about some of the other little gotchas with documents. For example, I have seen issues where people have not had a good match between either their driver license or passport with hair color or eye color or body weight and matching with the medical and all that kind of stuff. Talk to us about those issues and any recommendations you have on one form of photo ID versus another.
Sure. So as we think about which form of photo ID to use and how that best matches with what you're going to be using in IACRA as an applicant or as an instructor working with your students, there are certainly some documents that are more what we'll call inclusive of details than others. The passport is fairly limited and doesn't include things like your address, whereas a state ID or a driver's license would include other details. And this is where the maybe a little bit of behind the curtains comes into play. While the FAA requires that you have an address in your application that is a residential address, and if it's not a residential address, that you provide physical description of how to get there. So if you live in the third tent from the highest peak in the Andes, you're going to have to provide them description of how to get there instead of just the address. But the address is something that can change on every application. So if you have an address change coming up and you're also getting your instrument rating at the same time, you can execute that address change at the same time. So the thing that examiners are trying to avoid is that dreaded return packet from the FAA. This is also something that we get evaluated on as examiners. Are we getting packets back because we have missed things in the qualifying phases or we've made mistakes in the application process? A couple things that don't necessarily cause return packets unless they're an invalid data piece, like an invalid address, include changes of address. But things that will cause returns are things like changes in hair color. If your height changes by more than 2 inches, so for example, if you had 60 on the last one, as in 6'0", and it really should have been 72, which is 72 inches, how we're supposed to put it in there. Put 60 on the last one, you put 72 on this one, and the examiner says, hey, 72 inches sounds better. That's actually 6 feet tall, and he submits it that way. It's going to get sent back to us and said, hey, the last one said he was 60 inches tall. So those are errors that are going to cause it to come back to us as examiners, and they're things that we want to watch for as we look at the application information. But I will say the FAA doesn't necessarily have a copy of your passport. They don't have a copy of your driver's license. So if there are small discrepancies between it, as long as the FAA documentation remains consistent, it's not likely to cause returns of airman certification files. Weight is another one in there, Max, you mentioned, that does not cause a change. And the weight of every application that we take seems to go up when I take mine. I've been working on that over the years here. But the FAA doesn't kick it back because you got 5 extra pounds on there from the last one. So
it's funny. I remember taking my ATP Checkride, and the examiner looked at my medical, and he said, wait, you're not 75 inches tall or something like that. And I said, oh, that was a mistake they made on that medical here. And I had like the last 5 or 6 medicals, stuffed in my logbook. And I showed him, look, 72, 72, 72, 75, 72. So he was like, oh, okay. But you could tell by the look on his face, he thought maybe I was trying to pull a fast one.
Well, he wasn't looking to see if you were pulling a fast one. He was just looking to make sure he didn't get a packet returned to him.
Yeah.
So I will say this: the discrepancies between the medical and the pilot certificate data do not necessarily cross-populate either. So if you have a medical that was typed in error as 75 inches, and your last pilot certificate said 72, and your current pilot certificate says 72 in the application, it's not going to get kicked back because your medical said 75. That's something you could just fix on your next medical process too.
Okay, so it sounds to me like from a document standpoint, the most important name match in terms of having, first, full, middle, full, last is that the medical, the student pilot certificate, and the IACRA all match.
Correct. And making sure those three things are going to be the same. That way, when you do enter knowledge tests, they are going to populate properly and associate that name with the proper applicant.
Oh, there's a good point. What if the knowledge test name is not complete, first, full, and last?
Correct, and then it will not necessarily match up. Or, for example, if you have John Smith Doe Jr., and on your pilot certificate it's John Smith Doe, and you've never used the junior before, that will not necessarily match up. So one way to fix an errored knowledge test is actually to contact the FAA knowledge test administrators, the Airman Certification Branch out there. I'm sorry, the Airman's Testing Branch in Oklahoma City, and they can make a name change to a knowledge test that did have an error on it or missing data. That being said, that does take a little bit of time, and I would expect for most people to plan on a 7 to 10 business day turnaround if they do need to have a change in a knowledge test name to make it match up with an FAA application in IACRA.
Okay, got it. So if the knowledge test name needs to be changed, we go to Oklahoma City. IACRA name change, we can do that on the fly while sitting with the examiner. Student pilot certificate name change, got to run down to the FSDO to do that. What about the medical?
So the medical is actually something that has to be changed with the AME that did the medical itself. So if they made an error in it, they are going to have to make that change. And I think what you're finding here is most of these things are going to take a little bit of time, and this is where it's a good idea to not wait until the day before that test to get your medical, or the day before that practical test to take your knowledge test, to get these things pre-set up a little bit ahead of time and give yourself a couple weeks of planning to make sure all these things are going to match up. So on the day of the practical test, you're not trying to scrounge and fix these things at the last moment.
You were talking about the endorsements, 4 different categories: aeronautical experience and so on. What about the endorsements for ground instruction? Tell us about those and what you're looking for.
So the ground instruction endorsements are a little bit vague. We don't necessarily have guidance on how ground instruction is required to be logged for most Part 61 training. We do certainly have some of that in a Part 141 environment, although from an examiner standpoint, the liability for the majority of that is covered by the graduation certificate that we see that says, yep, they've met the requirements for the 141 certificate and they're good to go for that test. When it comes to the endorsements, I'm really looking for the endorsements that the instructor has said, I have covered all the areas required for the ground instruction. They have the aeronautical knowledge endorsement completed. I can't tell you that I have personally found any specific requirements that say I need to see, 8 entries of ground instruction. There is no actual requirement to show us the documentation of how that logging is completed. It's certainly a really good idea to do as an instructor, to have a good syllabus that you use or some way to track to make sure you are doing all of the required instruction. But I don't necessarily need to see a log of ground training on the day of that practical test.
I see. So rather than seeing all 10 items on a particular ground requirement listed individually, you're saying that a single endorsement for everything under that 61 dot whatever it is sufficient.
That is correct. Now, if the FAA were to come back to the instructor and say, hey, show me how you did that and what days you did it, there's a reasonable expectation that they would be able to document some way that they have provided that ground instruction and that the knowledge base is there.
And I've heard examiners say, no, we got to see all 10 of these items listed here and signed off. Now, you used the word liability just a moment ago. Are these related? Tell us about examiners and kind of liability they face and how they may choose to reduce their liability.
Well, sure. There's a really open question here of what is the examiner liability, and there's 2 pieces there. There's the administrative liability of have we done our job correctly and have we properly qualified an applicant and administrated that test. And that's the liability that we have of giving that test to make sure we have done that on any given day. Then there's also probably a different question of what is the civil liability of an examiner who administers tests. And there have been very, very few tests of this out there where, for example, if an examiner had somebody that they tested who then went out and was involved in an accident or incident, would there be a civil lawsuit potential there for any damages that were incurred for lack of testing? And I think that, the administrative side there is important to that potential civil liability of have you done your job in the administrative manner that's prescribed? If you've done that, your civil liability is limited because you're doing the job as you're supposed to. And, there are rare occasions where criminal liability has come into play, where examiners have forged things, have not properly administrated tests along the guidance of either the regulations or the FAA order documents. And in those cases, the liability can be very severe.
And I've heard of cases where students may have to actually do their check ride again. Tell us about that if the examiner is found to be liable in some way.
So that's certainly the worst of the worst for many of the applicants when we find an examiner not doing their job properly in accordance with FAA regulations and or order documents, where if the FAA has found an examiner not doing the job properly, that they may choose to re-administer the practical tests to any and or all of the applicants an examiner has worked with. And there's some of these cases where they're less severe than others, and we've had some cases where the impact has been large with 600 or 700 people receiving retest notifications and having to either retest, or if they had subsequently tested with other examiners, may be exempted from the requirement. But, as an applicant or an instructor, if you find you have an examiner who's not fully testing your applicants, if they say, geez, I know we got to do 3 takeoffs and landings on this check ride. There's a short field, a soft field, and power off, but I just feel like doing the soft field today. It's important to make sure that the full test is being given so that it does meet the requirements of those airman certification or the few practical test standards relevance points that are still out there to make that a valid test. And it does take time to do that. If you find the Santa Claus examiner that, boy, everybody likes to send somebody to because the check ride only takes an hour and he drinks coffee for 45 minutes of it, I'd probably start worrying about the fact that at some point that's going to catch up, and there's a good chance a number of your applicants may end up with a notification to retest. So as much as we all want to find a nice, easy examiner and pass, you kind of want to earn this too, and make sure you are working with an examiner who's giving a good, fair, and complete practical test to make sure that you've got a good basis for that rating or certificate that you've passed.
Now, what if a flight instructor is concerned that they have an examiner that is not really playing ball the way they're supposed to, in whatever way they're not being a good examiner? What would you suggest that they do to follow up on that?
So as we think about the fact that, sometimes we find examiners who aren't necessarily doing their job maybe the way we want them to do it, there's a couple things that can be done. And if we find some concerns, a flight instructor or a flight school operator certainly has the option to call their flight standards office and give them a call and say, hey, here's a couple concerns. And that flight standards office should keep that conversation in confidence and work with the examiner. And certainly if there's something that's being done that's blatantly incorrect, I strongly encourage a conversation with your local flight standards office because they're the individuals who are going to work with that designated pilot examiner on a regular basis to, one, make sure they're doing the job properly. And if they're not, help them either retrain so they can do it properly, or ask them to step down as an examiner if necessary. And there are things that we all do wrong, and certainly there are things that as we go through changes in training regulations or training structure in our industry, we all have things we have to learn how to do properly and learn about and make sure we're doing that. And this is a learning environment for not just the applicants and the instructors, but certainly the examiners too. We're all trying to stay on top of this policy as well. If they're uncomfortable having a conversation with their local FAA office for fear of retribution or fear of making somebody unhappy, There is actually a national email that is out there as well, and it's kind of a tough, long email to find. But if you do a little Google searching for email feedback concerns about FAA practical tests, there's a couple sites that'll come up on. Probably the easiest one is on the Flight School Association of North America. It's fasana.com, kind of on the bottom right side. There's actually a link to this email, and somebody can directly email any concerns about FAA practical tests directly to the designee oversight branch of the FAA in Oklahoma City that takes it outside of their regional office, their local office, and brings it up to a national level. And they can then follow back up with any specific examiner concerns. And this is not where we want to say, man, the examiner was mean to me. He only let me retry the maneuver 3 times. That's not what we're looking for here. We're looking for, okay, so we have a problem with how the test is being administrated. The examiner asked me to do the partial panel NDB inverted ILS, and geez, that's just not something I think is part of the training. So when we find there are real problems, we do want that feedback so we can help fix that out in our system.
And I'll go ahead and include the email address in the show notes here. So anybody who wants that can just tap on the artwork on their smartphone player or on the website. They can find it in the show notes. Let's go back to the beginning of the check ride. A lot of people show up and are nervous for the check ride. And we talked about that in an earlier episode when we talked about check ride anxiety. What do you do and what does the FAA expect you to do to deal with check ride anxiety?
It's a great question. And certainly as examiners, we've all been applicants before too. We had to get our pilot certificates and we had to become instructors, and we know exactly how terrifying it is to show up on the day of that practical test and have no idea who the person sitting across the table from you is going to be, especially for that first test, and have no idea what they're going to ask you when in reality we kind of have a pretty good idea. It's all going to come out of those airman certification standards. It's all going to come out of the practical test standards where they're still applicable, and it's pretty darn scary. So part of our job as an examiner is to hopefully not scare the applicant too bad. I like to tell my applicants, if you don't scare me today, I won't scare you. And it seems like a good way to make the check ride go. And many times an examiner will, prior to actually beginning the test, just have some conversation with you. And I do this a lot of times. It's not just how's the weather today, but it might be, so what do you think you want to do with flying? How are you looking at doing this as a career? Are you looking at it for fun? What do you want to do with it? And get a feel for the person. And you might find you have some common interests. A lot of times I'll have people that they realize I scuba dive and they'll start to poke at that. Gee, why do you scuba dive? Well, I'll talk to you more about that later as we ask about scuba diving and flying. And, we kind of bring life into the conversation prior to the beginning of the practical test too, because, we understand the applicants are there and they have a pretty high stress level that day, but we're all human. And I think it's important for the applicants to understand we are too. And I guess a good tidbit's always feed the examiner enough coffee. It'll give you a couple bathroom breaks while they relieve themselves. I'm pretty notorious for drinking too much coffee in the morning. So, the examiner's human too. So, and we're going to sit down and chat with you a little bit and try and help you understand that it's okay to talk with us the day of the test. And really that's what a practical test is it's a very inquisitive passenger who wants to ask a whole bunch of detailed questions, or probably the most annoying passenger that most pilots ever have, wants to know a lot of stuff about it. And if you kind of treat the check ride like a conversation with a friend who just doesn't know much about flying, but really wants to know a lot, that's really a good way to approach the check ride, and just kind of treat us like somebody you're having a conversation with, because we're just somebody who's wanting to have a conversation with you. We're not looking for Einstein's relativity theory applied to Bernoulli's principle here. We're looking for practical things that you can do to make sure you're a safe pilot and meet the requirements of the rating or certificate that you're applying for on that day.
Now, is it fair play for an applicant to find out ahead of time what your favorite drink at Starbucks is and show up with that at the check ride?
Not only is that fair play, that's just a darn fine recommendation. So
that's great. So what should an applicant expect from the examiner in the check ride? Are you going to be chatting a lot? Are you going to be Silent Sam? What's going to happen up there in the air?
Max, that's a great question. And it's actually one that is a little bit unique and different on a check ride or practical test from what most people have experienced with the previous flying they've done in their training with an instructor. A check ride day, the examiner is not the PIC, except for rare occasions. Main one that I would think of for that is if we're going to do an instrument practical test, and we do need to go into actual, the examiner has the option to accept PIC responsibilities to allow for filing, although the applicant is going to be the acting PIC during those moments. And that's really a different dynamic for many people in the air, and it's kind of unique that we'll be flying along and the examiner is probably going to be a lot quieter than your instructor ever has been on a practical test. Now, we'll certainly talk with an applicant along the way, and in some cases it may be purposefully to try and distract the applicant. That's one of our jobs under the ACS and many of the standards is to simulate like we're an annoying passenger who's distracting somebody. And it's perfectly fine for the PIC, the applicant, to say, hey, I need you to be quiet right now. I'm in the middle of my landing, and we'll talk about that when we get back on the ground. Or I need you to be quiet so I can catch that IFR clearance. But it is a different dynamic then. So, we really were looking for somebody to be that PIC to take charge of the aircraft and make the decisions. And it's pretty common when somebody, does a maneuver, maybe we'll do a steep turn and they look over at me and say, was that good enough? And I'll say, well, it met PTS or met ACS. Well, did I pass? It meets ACS or it doesn't. That's really what we're looking for. It's either within the standards or it's not. So you're not going to get that same feedback on a practical test from the examiner that you are going to get from an instructor or even a fellow passenger. Our job is just to test to see if somebody meets the standard. If they meet the standard, we continue on with the next maneuver. We're not allowed specifically by the FAA order to give instruction on the practical test. We'll give a good debrief after the test has been completed, but we're not going to do that during the test and say, hey, here's how that lazy 8 went. We can show you how to do a little bit better. That's not our job on that day. Our job is to test somebody, and actually the instrument check ride is probably the one I'm even the most quiet on. I'll typically go out and we'll do our unusual attitude recovery on the flight portion of it, and I will have given the applicant a series of approaches and holds and things like that to do for the test. And if everything's going well, I'm probably going to sit back and be pretty quiet on it. I'll flip back and forth on my iPhone or iPad between the approach plates we're using, and the rest of it's up to the applicant to coordinate with ATC and to handle the approaches. So it is a different dynamic, and I think that's worth understanding for somebody on a check ride to not be looking for that constant feedback from the examiner. It's either going to meet the ACS standards or it's not. If the examiner has to jump in and stop you from doing something, or if they have to tell you something's not going well, that's usually not a good moment in the check ride. So that being said, if the examiner hasn't said anything's bad, it usually means you're doing okay, because we are required at any point during a check ride, if we're going to issue a disapproval, to tell you at that point. So if they haven't said, hey, we've got a problem we got to talk about, you're either doing okay or you've scared them to the point of no longer speaking. So hopefully it's not the latter of those two.
So no news is good news.
No news is good news along the check ride.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your blog. Tell folks about that and where they can find out information about it.
Sure. I'm actually pretty darn easy to find on the internet. If you go to jasonblair.net, you're going to find a blog that I do post some things on there. Most recently, you're going to find some things. My wife and I just bought an airplane, and much to the difference of many, I'm going to call myself a younger generation pilot. We went and bought an airplane that's 30 years older than either of us and bought a 1947 Stinson and are having a little bit of fun with that. But I do post things that I see in the industry. And I also post in my website links and things to other writing that I have done. And certainly like to share anything I can and help anybody in the aviation industry in any way I can. So we're all pilots doing this together, and I don't think any of us have it completely perfectly figured out. And if there's something I can share, I certainly do that. And much of that ends up on my website at jasonblair.net.
Now, we haven't talked thus far about where you're located in the country. Would you like to tell us where you give check rides in case somebody's interested in flying with you for their next check ride?
I sure would, and actually, I think I'm one of the few examiners that if you go to jasonblair.net, there's a big box there that says schedule a check ride. I have online scheduling. It connects directly to my calendar, and you can see when I'm available. I work out of the Grand Rapids, Michigan Flight Standards office. So basically, Michigan and a little bit of northern Indiana is where I am at for the majority of my practical tests. And if somebody wants to come visit me here, would certainly love the opportunity to give them a practical test.
Is there anything more you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think we think about this as a pretty darn cool thing we do as flying. And I like to share with people that sometimes we overthink this stuff. And when it really comes down to it, we're defying gravity in a chunk of tin or a piece of composite or even fabric sometimes, and somehow powered by some gasoline and behind a big fan for most of us. It's pretty darn cool. And don't let that pass you by. If you're having that stressed out day and you're thinking the training's tough, just look outside and think how amazing it is. And this is 25 years I've been flying, and I still look outside the window on many practical tests, and I'm just kind of amazed by it. So it's pretty unique and special opportunity we all have that we get to do this. Don't take it for granted. As long as you can do it, enjoy it. And while the test may be tough some days, it certainly is a rewarding thing that we all get to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you point out how cool it is. Just yesterday, I was flying with a student pilot on her third flight in a Cirrus SR20, and I was so happy. She said, "Oh, the clouds, they look so beautiful." It's great when people really appreciate how nice it is up there.
It is.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us today on Aviation News Talk Podcast.
My pleasure. Look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thanks again. Well, Jason is just a great contributor to the general aviation industry, and I greatly appreciate people like him who share their expertise with others so they can be successful in achieving their aviation goals. Now, at the start of this show, I mentioned our Patreon sponsors. We don't have advertisers on this show, but we do have expenses, so I greatly appreciate the monthly contributions from our 66 Patreon supporters, each of whom donates via credit card each month. And during the last show of each month, I read the names of our biggest supporters who each contribute at least $20 a month. And those contributors are Jeremy Zawadny, who's a software developer, Peter Long, a pilot in Australia, formerly a CFI here in Silicon Valley, Seth Lake, military instructor pilot and flight instructor in Arkansas. You can find him at nogo.aero for his podcast and flight school. Jason Blair, who we just heard from, he's a designated pilot examiner. He runs his blog at jasonblair.net. Joseph Haggerty II, who's a Mooney owner and pilot. And we have two new additions to the list this month. I want to thank Michael Rogers. He's a Cirrus owner and pilot in Southern California. And Michael Spain. He's a student pilot working on his private and hopes to then do his instrument rating in Oklahoma. And he's also planning to buy a Cirrus. I really want to thank you for your contributions and thank everyone who helps support the show in some way. Now, if you're thinking, hey, I'd like to be a part of this special group who supports Aviation News Talk, just type into a web browser aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, or look at the podcast app on your phone, tap on the image on the top of the screen, and you can find a link to our Patreon page. There you can make a contribution toward this show for as little as $2 a month, and that cost will be billed to your credit card each month. And while you're on the Patreon site, check out the many aviation stories that I post each week on the blog. And don't forget, if you're thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me early in the process so I can help you with that decision. If you're looking at a new plane, I can help set up a free demo flight for you. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. And if you enjoy this show, please spread the word and tell your friends about it. If they're not familiar with how to find a podcast, send them to the Apple App Store on their smartphone. If they have an iPhone or iPad, tell them to search on Aviation News Talk or on Max Trescott, and they can download our new dedicated podcast app for the show. And finally, until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.